Welcome back. In this lecture, we briefly address the challenge of optimizing social welfare in an economic perspective. In this lecture, we highlight two specific issues: the distributional effects of financial stimulation schemes for electric vehicles and the issue of transaction costs. Most financial incentive schemes for electric vehicles, such as subsidies, involve some transfer of taxpayers' money to a specific group of early adopters. Both for private users and firms, the decision to be an early adopter is a combination of image or status and affordability. So in practice, early private adopters are mostly found in the high-income segment of the population and among the highly educated. Depending on the duration and scale of income transfer to this privileged group, the majority of the people may start to feel left behind at some moment, and if that happens, the government is at risk of eroding public support for the new technology. So it is therefore crucial to design a financial incentive scheme in such a way that it is clearly limited in time and in the extent of income transfer. Limited in time does not necessarily imply short duration, as innovative technologies that are in the interest of society as a whole may take many years to mature and to be embraced. The duration of the financial incentive scheme should therefore be aligned with the time needed to increase the efficiency of the new technology through upscaling and incremental improvement, and to reduce the costs to the extent that the new technology is made affordable for the population at large. As we discussed in previous lectures, the relative additional benefit of offering financial incentives for high-end vehicles is limited. Policymakers may therefore consider targeting financial benefit schemes to lower price segments of the electric vehicle market. First, this would provide an incentive for automakers to invest into developing a wider variety of electric vehicles in these lower-priced segments, as they become more affordable for many consumers. Second, this would also result in a more even distributional effect of the incentive scheme in society. And moreover, policymakers may consider offering additional incentives for second-hand electric vehicles, which could prevent export of used electric vehicles and therewith prevent associated leakage of subsidies to other countries. We have seen quite a few examples of this in Europe. As discussed in earlier lectures, the deployment of electric vehicle battery packs as flexibility providers for the power system entails a massive increase in transactions. Let me briefly dwell on the concept of transaction costs with an example. If you set out to buy a used car, you will investigate what cars are available on the market, and you will need more detailed information to find out which cars exactly match your requirements in terms of model, color, price, mileage, condition, and so forth. Once you have selected the one you would like to buy, you need to negotiate a price with the seller, and you need to make sure that the car is delivered in the promised condition and that the seller will remediate any defects that fall within the terms of the contract. Transaction costs are made up of all these efforts: search and information costs, bargaining costs, and measurement and enforcement costs. Now, take the electricity market before it was deregulated. Electricity was delivered to our homes by a regional monopolist, whether private or public. And this regional monopolist also produced, transported, and distributed the electricity. The transaction costs in this system were minimal, almost absent. We had no bargaining power and relied on governmental oversight to protect us from abuse of market power by the utility monopolist. Today, electricity, at least in most countries, is produced in competition, and the services provided in competition, and that includes the retail market in most countries. Obviously, the transaction costs in this system are much higher than in a formal monopoly, but that is not necessarily bad news, as competitive pressure and network regulation are curbing the overall costs of the power system to our benefit. Thanks to the rules for operation of the markets involved and the regulatory institutions in place, transaction costs are kept as low as possible, so that the benefits of the liberalized electricity market outweigh the transaction costs increase. You could say that the liberalized power system has enabled a shift to a new welfare optimum, which benefits society as a whole. In the future system, now we are taking a next step in complexity. Electricity and mobility service provision are envisaged to be intricately linked. With that, new actors are entering the stage, such as aggregators, charging point operators, and e-mobility service providers. And with new actors come new relationships, with new exchanges of information, data, electricity, and dollars, which are needed to make the system run, and which require new institutions to curb the new transaction costs. The overall increase in transaction costs must be weighed against the overall benefits. And these overall benefits largely hinge on the value of the flexibility that the battery packs of electric cars can provide to the electricity system. Another cost factor yet to be taken into account is the one of curbing cybersecurity risks in the future integrated electricity and e-mobility system. And given the many uncertainties about the new costs and vulnerabilities of this new system, we should perhaps more systematically weigh the costs and benefits of the new system against the alternative, which is simply expanding the capacity of the electricity infrastructure and building alternative energy storage units. Basically, this is a choice between a smart, highly complex, probably cheaper, integrated power and e-mobility system versus a probably more expensive, more reliable, very robust power system, which remains decoupled from the mobility system. Well, for consumers, we don't care, about most of this complexity, all these new transactions, and because most of this complexity is handled behind the scene, we don't even see it happening. What matters to us as an electric vehicle owner is, besides the purchase costs, the ease and the cost of battery charging. And charging costs do not only depend on the way the electric vehicle battery participates, in some flexibility scheme for the power system. In practice, many other factors play a role in determining the final cost that is incurred to us as consumers, especially when we are using the public charging infrastructure. So let us briefly have a look to what extent differences in charging costs can be justified on the basis of differences in local context and service levels provided. In the public electric vehicle charging chain, several actors contribute to the costs of charging. These include the grid operators, the utility, the charging point operator, and the e-service providers. The grid operator and utility bill the charging point operator for the grid connection and the energy delivered. And the charging point operator forwards these costs and a potential additional flexibility revenue to the consumer. The consumer uses the charging card he is provided with by the e-service provider to operate the charging station, and depending on the type of contract, he pays the service provider for the amount charged or for the time he was connected to the charging station. The factors that are dominant in determining the costs of charging are various. I'm just naming two. The first one is where you are charging, at a private or at a public charging station. At home, the hardware investment costs have been made by you, by the consumer himself. So only the electricity costs are left to be paid. But if a public charging station is used, the charging point operator has to recoup the investment by charging a premium on top of the electricity costs. And in addition, the consumer has to pay for access to the public charging station through the e-service provider. And of course, such additional costs can be justified by the additional investments made. From a policy perspective, however, it is important to understand that those of us who rely on street parking and thus on public charging cannot avoid this premium. So in the long run, this could result in distributional effects, as the richer segment of the population can mostly afford private parking and thus charge at home. Well, a second important factor I would like to mention that is important for the price of charging is obviously the speed of charging. High-speed chargers often ask a higher premium for charging, as this type of equipment and grid connection requires substantially higher investment costs than slow chargers. Prices at fast charging stations can be up to 5 times as high compared to slow charging at home or at the workplace. Given the fact that many fast charging stations today still do not make a profit, these high charges seem justified. Government could enable fast charging station operators to generate additional revenue streams, for example, by allowing them to offer additional sales, sales of food or beverages, or allowing them to build next to shopping malls, where they would attract more customers. But it is also evident that such permits clash with the permits and vested interests of established refueling stations. To wrap up, this lecture has shown that policymakers should be alert to various kinds of undesired effects of their policies and the policy instruments they employ to stimulate electric mobility. In this lecture, we focused on some of the economic pros and cons of current policies and showed how complicated it is to strike the right balance in a world full of uncertainties. And of course, the social welfare optimum is not a very well-defined concept, as it obviously involves many more economic effects, such as jobs lost and the creation of new jobs, and a lot more than economics, which brings us back to the different, to some extent competing, policy goals of public health, climate, energy, mobility, and general economic policy that we introduced in the first module. Too often, the siloed practice of policy making is a hindrance in creating a consistent policy framework that can adequately accommodate the integration of infrastructure service systems that is happening in the real world. So this calls for continuous measuring, reflecting, learning, and correcting efforts, and above all, for continuous observation of important public values such as fairness in policy making. Thank you.